This is the Fujifilm X-M1 and I managed to buy this pocket-sized mirrorless camera for just $200. This is hands down one of the most fun to use and portable interchangeable lens cameras that I currently own. So what makes this camera just so good, and if it is so good, why is it so cheap? Well, it's fair to say that this little camera did have a bit of a rocky start to life, but in order to explain that, we first need to go back to the beginning. The Fujifilm X-M1 was originally released just over 10 years ago now, and it was created as the little brother to the very popular X-E1 and original X Pro 1. Now, the X Pro 1 in particular quickly amassed a strong cult following because of its beautiful retro-inspired aesthetics and impressive new sensor technology, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later on. After that, the X-E1 came out, and that was equally revered because it was essentially just a trimmed-down, cheaper version of the X Pro 1. So Fujifilm thought, sod it, let's give it a third try, and they did it again by releasing the X-M1, which was basically a trimmed-down version of the already trimmed-down X-E1. So it was even smaller in size, and they even opted to remove the viewfinder entirely, along with giving it a more simplified range of controls. Now, unfortunately, the problem was that this camera was still quite expensive for its class, because at launch body only, this camera cost around $700, and it was competing against the likes of the popular Sony NEX-3N and the Panasonic GF6, which were both around $100 to $200 cheaper. So just a few months later, Fujifilm released the X-A1, which visually was practically identical to this X-M1, but instead it was predominantly made with cheaper plastics and included a standard Bayer sensor rather than Fujifilm's homegrown X-Trans sensor. Now, ultimately, all of these alterations allowed Fujifilm to drop the price of the X-A1 to make it around $100 cheaper than the X-M1, which brought it much closer in line with the other competition. And this strategy must have worked because the X-A line still continues today, whilst the X-M line was phased out with this X-M1, and this never saw an official predecessor. So, if this camera failed to impress at launch, why is it worth buying 10 years later? Well, it is worth reiterating that the MX1 didn't fail because it was a bad camera. It actually received some really good press. It was just quite expensive for its time. So fast forward to 2023, and now the opposite is true. This is actually a really affordable camera, and as I mentioned at the start, I bought this for £170 or roughly $200, and it's in near mint condition without a scratch on it. So what makes this camera so magical and worth buying? Well, I believe it's what lies behind the lens. As I alluded to earlier, this camera includes the first generation of Fujifilm's X-Trans sensor, which is a 16 megapixel APS-C size chip, and it's the same exact one that's featured in the X Pro 1 and the X-E1. In fact, a lot of the internals of this camera are exactly the same as the higher end models, just packed into this much smaller frame that's a lot easier to use as a daily carry-along. Just to demonstrate how small this thing is, if my massive hands aren't doing that for you, this is my X Pro 2, which obviously has a different sensor in it, but it's the same size and form factor as the original X Pro 1, and just putting these side by side, you can see just how much smaller the X-M1 is in comparison. And like I mentioned, this has got the same sensor, the same processor, and the same 6 frames per second burst rate. Now, if you happen to stumble across any kind of forums online talking about the X-Trans sensor or Fujifilm cameras in general, you'll know that this X-Trans sensor, as in the first generation, a lot of people regard it as the GOAT of X-Trans sensors. And a lot of that's to do with its age, because it produces images with a tonality and a range of colors that look much closer to film photography. Now, I do think a lot of that is down to your own personal preference and the nuance and romanticism around this old camera, but I cannot deny that this camera is capable of capturing stunning looking images with a very unique look. And that makes it well suited to any photographer like myself who likes capturing images with that retro film aesthetic. And obviously, being a Fujifilm camera, you also have access to a range of film simulation modes. Should you not want to bother with editing your photos afterwards, you can just produce film-like looking images straight out of the camera. Now, although I should mention that the film simulations on this early camera aren't anywhere near as extensive as the more recent models, you can still find a healthy range of film recipes online for this camera and the X-Trans 1 sensors specifically, which are super fun to experiment with. But even if the whole retro thing isn't your bag and you're just looking for a relatively affordable mirrorless camera to get you started on your photography journey, then this is still, at the very least, a very good camera to consider, because it's a great gateway to the Fujifilm mirrorless camera system. And of course, any of the lenses you buy for this camera will still be compatible with any of the other APS-C Fujifilm cameras you might want to upgrade to in the future. Now, speaking of lenses, I've mainly been shooting with this TTartisan's 25mm f2 lens, which is not only super small and very cheap, priced at just $52. It's actually impressively sharp as well, and this definitely helps to keep the camera very pocketable. Although this is a very small camera, and sometimes with smaller cameras the ergonomics are very questionable, I must admit that the ergonomics on this particular camera are actually better than you may think. There are two command dials on it that are easy to reach and operate just using your thumb, and the slightly raised section at the front of the camera just gives you the right amount to purchase to hold even with larger hands. Though one thing I did buy that helped to improve the ergonomics of this camera a little bit further was just this simple hot shoe attachment, which only cost me a few bucks on Amazon. It's such a small add-on, but it does give my thumb somewhere nice to rest whilst I'm shooting, and it also helps to prevent me from accidentally knocking any of the rear dials. I'll be sure to leave links to this accessory and also this lens in the video description if any of you are interested. Now, I am not going to sit here and pretend that this camera is absolutely perfect and there's nothing wrong about it, because no camera is flawless. So inevitably I do have a few gripes with it, and the first thing is the just lack of customizable buttons. There is only one button on this whole camera that can be customized, and that's located here next to the shutter button on the top plate, and even that has a very limited amount of options, most of which aren't that useful. All of the other buttons on this thing have to stay as they are labeled, which is slightly frustrating because there's quite a few of them, and some of them just have a slightly redundant functionality. For example, there's a whole button dedicated to turning macro AF on and off, which of course is only useful when you're shooting up close with a lens that has macro capabilities, which none of my lenses do. Also, the video record button is in a bit of an awkward position. It's right where your thumb squeezes the back of the camera. So I have on occasion accidentally pressed that button and then just started recording video without realizing. Luckily though, this does happen much less often now that I've bought this attachment, because it just means that my thumb steers well clear of any of these buttons. So if that's going to get annoying for you, I would highly recommend buying one of these. Now, I'll be honest, I did think that not having an EVF would eventually get annoying and it would be something I didn't like too much. But in fact, I actually think that the lack of a viewfinder has its benefits, particularly in the context of street photography. And that's because without an EVF, you aren't constantly raising the camera to your face to take a photo. And obviously making this movement over and over again is often the first thing that people will notice out of the corner of their eye, and they'll just turn and look at you. Also, unlike the X Pro one and the XE one, which both have a large 3-inch screen that's fixed in place, so you are basically forced to bring the camera up to your eye all the time if you want to shoot at a low level, the XM1 has a 3-inch tiltable screen. So I often find that when I'm shooting with this camera, I'm shooting from chest height or from the hip and sort of looking down. And this just makes you way more inconspicuous when you're trying to blend in with the crowd and capture candid shots of everyday life. I think ultimately my favorite thing about this camera is that it may have been forgotten by many over the years, but in a world filled now with big and expensive cameras, this is a very nice reminder that you can still find joy in even the smallest of packages. That's what she said.